On this episode of another Zelda podcast, David and Kate talk about all of the varying art styles that have graced the series. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Zelda podcast. I am your co-host, David Geisler, here today with my co-host,
Kate Fischer!
Oh, there it is.
That's
Fantastic.
Me. I felt like that was my cue.
I did take a breath there for a second. It's true.
Kate Fischer!
It was a big, thick comma there in my sentence. Kate, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
You well? I'm well. I'm very excited about what we're talking about tonight. This is a topic that actually you came up with. You were like, let's talk about this.
At the very last minute, yeah. I was just like kind of thinking in, preparation for another episode, I was thinking about the differences between games, and I'm like, most of them look so different from each other. So I thought we'd maybe go over like the evolution and the differences in the art styles over the history of all the games.
I love it. And we were chatting about the different episodes that we'll be doing. And last week we had the NPC episode and said, well, I don't mind grabbing a couple notes on this topic. I think it's awesome. And this is what I think we'll do. And I want to get to some listener feedback in a second here, but first let's set this up. I have a list here of basically the entire Zelda timeline in the real world release order.
Right.
And because the art styles of Zelda games, some of them are creative choices, and there have been, much like the canonical timeline, there are splits in graphics and trends that we see in the real world, certain art styles that permeate into certain threads of the games, but largely these art styles are determined, in my opinion, by the abilities and restrictions of the consoles that the game is getting released on. Yes, and I think this will be interesting because you can speak more toward that aspect, and I'm just going to be like, I like this one. Hey, that's fine with me. That's fine with me. So I think that makes sense that we kind of go through time, Earth time, real time. We talk about The Legend of Zelda on the Nintendo Entertainment System first, and then keep going through. Because in some ways, I think we'll be able to track how the small ways that the technology of the systems did change some of the art styles. And perhaps sometimes we'll also be able to examine how art styles were decided simply from a creative point of view. Yeah. Sounds good to me. Excellent. So before we dive in too deep, not too deep, but before we get started on that, it's been a while, I feel like, since I've hosted. I guess it's only been a couple episodes. But anyway, I have a little bit of listener feedback that I'd like to get to, if you don't mind. Sure. Real quick, from the recording of this episode, I think this episode will come out a couple weeks after we are recording it, to be honest. We're kind of pre-recording this one, but about a week or so ago, Nintendo had their big, not expo, but their was it a Nintendo Direct, I think? Oh, I don't know. Oh, yeah? Okay. Never mind. I was late on the news. The important thing is that Smash Brothers was announced. Yes, I heard that. For the Nintendo Switch. We don't exactly know what kind of a Smash Brothers it is. It does not have a subtitle. We don't know if it's going to be a re-release with bonus content a la Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Okay. We don't know if it's just going to be more of the Smash Brothers Wii U version. It seems like it's going to be original. It was the teaseriest teaser trailer. It really was. There was like nothing but two silhouettes, basically. It started as a Splatoon trailer. You thought it was some kind of Splatoon thing. And then it was kind of epic when that little squid character turned around and we saw the logo in her pupil. That was super cool. It was. But what was more fun was they cut to a close-up of Mario backlit, and they cut to a close-up of Link backlit. Yes. And what art style was Link in that trailer? Do you recall? It looked more like Breath of the Wild to me. Indeed it was. Now, for the past couple iterations, Link has been styled after the Twilight Princess Link. Which I wouldn't have a problem with that either. Yeah. Well, the first Super Smash Brothers used a model that was very, very similar to the Ocarina of Time model. It had a couple less polygons because, well, that first Super Smash Brothers, a lot of the characters didn't have a high polygon count, which was a little weird. Maybe it was just, I'm not sure why, because it doesn't seem like it was rendering a lot of stuff, but I won't get into that. And then certainly with the GameCube version, Link was stylized after the Twilight Princess model. And I think he also loosely is in the Wii U version. So Breath of the Wild style Link is coming to Switch. And I literally pulled up the YouTube video and did a home button, power button screen grab of the video playing, cropped it to a square and threw it on our Instagram account a couple weeks ago, and it got a whole bunch of likes. It got many likes. It received many likes there. That's called English. And I very cleverly titled it Just Breathe because I was very excited and I was trying to reference the Breath of the Wild thing, and maybe it was more clever than it needed to be. However,
I picked up what you were putting down.
The Switch Boy, he commented very quickly and just said, "What a jaw-dropping moment to see that trailer," which was very exciting. So Link will be coming back, and we'll see. I suspect that because Link is a new model, and that Mario model sure looked like the Mario Odyssey style to me too, just subtly, you know? And
I mean, that would make the most sense. I
mean, it would. It really would. And so I'm hoping that means a new Smash Brothers, and that's really cool.
Yeah.
I loved Brawl on GameCube. I played it like crazy. And it was Brawl Wii. It was Melee on GameCube and then Brawl on Wii. I actually enjoyed both of them, but I kind of missed the mark on. I didn't really play the Wii U Smash Brothers very much.
And I didn't have a Wii U, so I did not play that one at all.
Yeah, fair enough. So, it'd be exciting. You have a Switch, and
I do.
Perhaps then I'll have a Switch as well. It'd be fun to get back into Smash Brothers a little.
It seems like there are a lot of exciting things on the horizon for Switch. I think
Switch is doing great.
2018 might be a
Switch
good year.
Is doing great right now.
It is.
Switch is everything people wanted the Wii U to be.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? That whole have to be 40 feet from, it's just an ad hoc screen thing. It's the best they could do at the time for Wii U. Anyway, let's keep moving. We have another. I want to talk about some comments on YouTube.
Okay.
And remember, you can comment to us on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube by searching Another Zelda Podcast, and you can tweet to us at Another Zelda Pod. As we discuss things on this episode, please be inclined to make comments because we can follow up on them in future episodes.
Yeah.
Like so. Let's see here. I think we are going to talk about. So we have a comment here on YouTube on actually this is a comment that only happened a few weeks ago, but it was on our first episode. So this gentleman, I assume, Madden Man, must have gone back and listened to our first episode. And he said, in regards to that episode, he said, "I totally agree about not being able to talk to anyone about Zelda. My friend got a 2DS for Christmas, and Ocarina of Time was pre-installed, and he never plays it and hates talking about it." Kate, he's obviously making a comment about your statement that you quickly mentioned in our first episode about maybe sometimes you can't find people to talk about Zelda with in the real world.
Yeah.
How do you feel about this comment?
Not too often. I love it. You can talk to us.
Madden Men,
we'll talk to you about it. Yeah, every so often I meet someone that's it almost seems like you have to be really into Zelda or something. Like, I don't know that many people that have played it and are like, eh. So they either haven't played it at all, or
people either really like it or they don't play it.
Yeah. And I haven't found too many of the really liked it.
Interesting.
Or, have played it before. I don't know why that is. It's not an unpopular game. It's not hard
it's not niche or
to
anything.
find
This is
game. So
Zelda is coming up on being one of the it's almost, sometimes I see more Zelda paraphernalia in stores than Mario paraphernalia these days.
So I don't know what it is, but I find that people who have played it really do like to talk about it. So they're few and far between, but when you
and that's the thing about
find one.
It's like, oh, is it a video game podcast? No, we're doing a show about Zelda, and there are so many different ways that people can play video games. There's so many different video games that people can play. And so maybe even if someone says, oh, I like games, but it's not about liking Zelda or not. It's there's many different ways to express that, and that's okay.
And there's so many elements to Zelda. Like this episode is art styles. You don't have to, you can talk about art styles in other video games too. And that's just one aspect of the games.
So maybe Madden Man's friend got the 2DS to play something else and just doesn't care about Ocarina. And I guess that's okay. Feels like a missed opportunity because that's a wonderful game. But
I've been trying to get my fiance to play Legend of Zelda since 7 years ago when we met, and it did not happen until Breath of the Wild.
Breath of the Wild cracked the seal there,
It did.
I can see that a little bit.
I was like, you have to play Ocarina of Time. And he's just like, meh. So maybe it'll take your friend a little bit of time. Who knows? But once someone plays the game, they'll get it. They'll want to talk about it.
Super cool. Yeah, Breath of the Wild is that kind of rare treat where Nintendo was able to reach out and maybe appeal to a wider audience with by introducing certain game mechanics that are a little bit more conventional in modern games, but at the same time, for the most part, not losing the Zelda feel.
I think at this point, there's something for everyone.
And I posited a few episodes ago that maybe now that Breath of the Wild has done this, maybe it would be okay to return to some of the classic themes in a Zelda game. The Breath of the Wild sequel, maybe having more typical dungeons or a slightly more linear narrative or something like that.
Yeah, they can do anything. I'm
I think
really
they could at this
excited to
point.
see what comes next.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Kate, let's get into it here. Let's talk
All right.
about art styles in Zelda games. Obviously, the very first game is The Legend of Zelda for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Here in
Yes.
America, it actually came out for the Famicom Disk System in Japan. And that's why there's the battery save in America, because in Japan, you saved to not an optical disc, a magnetic disc, very similar to the 3.5-inch floppies that we have
Okay.
here or everywhere in the world. But The Legend of Zelda was actually, and it was originally, there was a concept, maybe it is also now Legend, but I think originally it was called like Mario Adventure or something. It was when it was first really being built, Miyamoto, he was trying to make something, not something that was the opposite of Mario, but a kind of other side of the coin kind of experience. Whereas Mario games are really about skilled execution of mechanics, literally platforming and jumping and stuff like that. And that's where the fun comes from a good Mario game. And in a Zelda game, it's kind of the opposite. A lot of the fun comes from the story and the immersion and potentially deeper gameplay, frankly. We're not talking about it being a role-playing game.
Right.
That's the kind of fun thing about The Legend of Zelda, certainly the first one, which was released in 1986. The first The Legend of Zelda kind of took a lot of the things that were exciting about role-playing games that were happening in video games at that time. And the joke is Zelda took all the numbers out. So instead of like, I've got a sword that's 20 plus damage of blah, 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 which is really cool for some games. You know what I mean? Zelda just said, you have the brown sword, the white sword. Okay, now it's double. Now it's half. And they made it a lot much more simple, which is why it's often referred to as an adventure game, not necessarily an RPG.
Gotcha. Which is
Zelda games in general.
Breath of the Wild brought that back a little
Breath
bit.
of the Wild brought it back in a big way, and some people have issues with that. They said, why'd all the numbers come back in? In fact, some people have said that in Breath of the Wild, you could have swords that, from an aesthetic point of view, look identical, and the only way you know that they're different is because when you go into the menus and see that this has a plus 10 power or whatever. I'm okay with that a little bit because I do like some of the classic RPG things.
Sure.
But The Legend of Zelda, we'll speak about it from an American perspective, a North American perspective. It was the classic, it was the gold cartridge that everybody remembers from their childhood, I suspect. I certainly remember.
Well, I was born the year it came out, so that would explain why I don't have that much experience.
Well, I was only 4 years old in
That's true.
1986, but
you weren't 33 already?
I think I was 33 in 1986, so that was pretty cool. So when The Legend of Zelda came out, I recall being exposed to it more maybe when I was 6 or 7, hearing about it. I'd already been playing Mario a little bit. This is before Mario Brothers 2 or Mario Brothers USA came out.
Okay.
And I would rent it here and there. And I was horrible at it. And that first game is still, if you don't play it correctly, in quotes, it is a very hard game to play.
I think that's, one that I tried to play. I'm trying to remember which ones are available in the Wii virtual.
This one's definitely on the Virtual Console. It's
so I
also
did
on the
get
NES
this one.
Classic,
Okay.
NES Mini Classic, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So I did get this one, and it was difficult.
I've since gone through and beaten it in a very enjoyable way, but you definitely, as an adult, you have to go, okay, I get it. I have to play this game, how the game wants to be played. And what I mean from a mechanics point of view, you can't just kind of run around and slash. You have to be very strategic. But really, to get back to the aesthetic,
How different is it from other game, for
of the
other
time?
games of that time?
Well,
for that
it's all,
system?
it's all just these little sprites. Very, very simple graphics, actually. And some of the, in my opinion, some of the famous things about The Legend of Zelda for the NES is this kind of famous, you touch the side of the screen and you scroll to the next chunk. Now, this happened in a time, the Nintendo Entertainment System was very good at doing horizontal scrolling. It was a little less good at doing vertical scrolling, or rather, it could only do one direction at a time. That's why, like, when you play the original Metroid, you can scroll left to right, and then you enter a different room, and all of a sudden you're scrolling up and down a column.
Gotcha.
Then you enter a door, and then you're scrolling sideways again. It wasn't until Super Mario Brothers 3 ish came out, and extra chips were put into the cartridges that allowed for diagonal scrolling and multi-directional scrolling.
Okay, yep.
So one of the ways, so that affected The Legend of Zelda. You know, one of the ways that they did this is when you touch the side of the screen. Okay, if you ever play that game again, notice that the horizontal scrolling is very, very smooth, and the vertical scrolling is kind of chunky.
Okay.
It actually scrolls like in half sprites. It's kind of when you scroll vertically. So that was definitely a restriction. So every single part of that world is built so that each screen has its own identity. You know, when you're in the desert areas of The Legend of Zelda, it feels much bigger because if you actually could just see the whole thing, you realize the whole desert's only 4 screens. That kind of stuff. Or the lake feels humongous. It feels like an ocean, the lake that surrounds the first dungeon, because it's actually, I guess it would be 8 screens that are surround that center screen of a 9 screen matrix.
Yeah, I ran into that with Link's Awakening too. It just seemed way bigger than it actually was.
Yes, that's actually a very, very good point. I think we can speak to that. So let's move forward a little bit here, because that's, for me, that's the main aesthetic that it was using. Something that's important to point out is that, to my understanding, the original The Legend of Zelda, with the exception of the save mechanic, which required a battery to be put into the cartridge, it was using, for the most part, stock Nintendo Entertainment System hardware.
Okay.
Just like the original Mario Brothers was. They were not putting in extra chips into the cartridge, so to speak.
Cool.
So then we move on to Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, and we have a drastic shift in the aesthetic. Now, this is a wonderful example of the technology hasn't changed much, but the aesthetic is very different. When you look at screenshots of Zelda 2,
which I had been,
yeah. What is your take? Because I think you have not really played that one too much.
I have not.
There's an overworld. There's a really chunky kind of overworld, much more like Final Fantasy games, where you're not scrolling, but you're moving grid to grid, piece to piece.
Okay.
And the graphics are very chunky in the overworld. And then you enter dungeons and towns and you switch to side scrolling.
Yeah.
I have a screenshot up right now.
Yeah,
of
so
some of that
Adventure of Link
side-scrolling.
just looks much more clean and in detail.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. The ability of the programmers to program cleaner graphics, I think, was certainly there. A couple years later, this came out in 1987. Oh, I guess only a year later. And to my knowledge, it was still using stock hardware. It was using the normal system hardware, but I can't speak to that exactly. But I did just realize they did start to bring in the number mechanic. You do actually kind of level up certain items in The Legend of Zelda, The Adventure of Link.
Yeah.
Also, another thing is Link was 2 sprites tall in the side-scrolling mode. And so that brought on a mechanic. I know we're talking about art style, but that brought on a mechanic where there was the sword fighting, which we would see later realized in Skyward Sword and stuff like that. It was not just about hitting the sword; it was about ducking and hitting the sword, or holding the shield. You could hold the shield at your kneecaps or at your waist, and you could swipe at up, above, or lower. So when enemies would come at you, there was a whole shield sword mechanic happening. And this art style, this side-scrolling art style, certainly enabled that. Top down, you can't really get that.
Okay. Yeah, these are the ones I was like, I'm going to have Dave talk more about these, because these are the ones that I am really not nearly as familiar with.
That's totally fine. I'm just trying to kind of hit them as we go, because then we'll get into some of the more more artistic things. So
it looks a lot like Mario too.
Well, there is something to be said for that. The Adventure of Link, it was interesting from an aesthetic. The visual became more like Mario, which some could argue is a less deep experience. There are mechanics and nuance to Mario, but I think you understand what I'm saying. It's a platformer, not an adventure game.
Yeah.
As an adventure game, Zelda's starting to look a little bit more like Mario. There's a jump mechanic and stuff like that. But then on the other side, when you're in the overworld and when you're getting these items, The Legend of Zelda, The Adventure of Link actually kind of went a little closer to RPG deep down inside. Where, as I said, The Legend of Zelda took out all the numbers. The Adventure of Link kind of brought some numbers back in. So then there's a little bit of time passes. We go to 1991, and A Link to the Past comes out for the Super Nintendo. We obviously have a new system now. Very exciting things have happened. A Link to the Past introduces a new art style. To some, it is the definitive art style. A Link to the Past was a very important game when it came out.
Yeah, this is the one, and I have played this one a little bit as well, but this is the one that kind of was the most interesting looking to me of the earlier games. This is one where I went, oh, this is cute, actually.
Yeah.
Like, I would use the word cute.
Yeah, it is. I agree. Whereas the first two Zelda games were, you could interpret all those little pixels as being a little bit grittier and perhaps a little bit more realistic.
This is like cartoonish at this point.
I agree.
Everything's a little rounder.
Everything's
at the
rounder.
edges.
Link's hair bounces. It's, some would disagree, but it's pink.
Oh, his hair?
Yeah.
It's just cuter. This is the style of game that, like, as a kid, I would have, if I had known about this game, which I honestly didn't, I would have absolutely been drawn to.
And I think that A Link to the Past came out at a time where, because the Super Nintendo was comparatively so strong at rendering graphics, we were seeing a trend where a lot of the graphics were getting cuter and less square, you know? We're seeing rounder sprites and bigger sprites and sprites that are moving on top of each other. So I think there was an artistic trend to go towards the cutesy look because in some ways we were making it look less like it was coming off a computer chip.
Yeah, and the colors are brighter too. Or
Certainly.
at least maybe, I don't know.
No, I would agree.
Brighter or more vibrant or just like more pleasing to the eye. 'Cause
even when you're in the dark world, it's still brighter and more colorful than some games.
when we were looking at the... what were we just looking at? The one
A Link
Adventure of Link.
Yep.
Those colors seem just harsher to me.
Yes. Yes. In some ways, I don't know. You know, even though the Adventure of Link has more detail in its sprites, the color palette seems dingier than even the original.
Yeah, I agree. It's just more like it's not as pleasing to the eye.
Sure.
So then, when you're looking at Link to the Past, you're like, oh, okay, I like that. I like the look.
Something
Although
I think,
that is Mario-ish too for that Mario.
I agree.
Which Mario game am I thinking of? Tell me.
I'm not sure. Super Mario World.
Yes.
Had a very similar kind
it
of
looks
things
just
are
like
rounded.
that. And that's probably why I'm drawn to this one because I love that game very much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then I think we could speak about another thing with A Link to the Past. There was kind of an homage to the original game. The original game had to, as I said, scroll. Every single time you touch the side of the screen, the way that they wrote the code, they would load up a new part of the map. And there wasn't, because you couldn't scroll on angles. You could only scroll up or down or left or right. And that's how they decided to deal with it in the original. In this game, you could scroll in all 8 directions, we'll say. And that is super cool, but they still kind of homaged the original because you might recall that in A Link to the Past, there's still edges of screens that you touch and it'll still scroll over. It's just that those screens are maybe twice as big. You scroll around inside a screen, quote unquote screen, because it's not even a screen anymore,
right.
But a section of the map, and you will hit an edge, and then it will still scroll over to another section of the map. Do you recall that at all?
I only played a little bit of this one.
Yeah,
this
sure.
is the one where I want to go back and check it
So
out again.
how about this? You know, I said in our last episode that maybe we do Four Swords Adventures as our next review one. But Four Swords Adventures, which we'll talk about in a moment here, is inspired very much by the graphics of A Link to the Past.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps first or perhaps after you and I both take a deep dive into Link to the Past and do a review episode.
Yeah.
That might take us 2 or 3 months to really get to, but I think that'd be a lot of fun.
I believe that's the other one that I have on the Wii for virtual.
Let's push it up a little further on the list of games that we might review and talk about.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so Link to the Past, that's awesome. And then, as I've already mentioned in our Link's Awakening episode just 2 episodes ago, we get what's essentially A Link to the Past realized on the Game Boy. Some things don't happen. We don't get the 8-directional scrolling that happens in A Link to the Past. The graphics, let me ask you, since you did just recently play A Link to the Past, comparing it to the other 3 games, where does it fall for you in comparison to those 3 games?
It's hard to judge because this is a Game Boy game versus...
So it's on an 8-bit system, slightly different architecture, but it's an 8-bit system, which is technically similar to the very first Zelda game.
Yeah, so I don't know. So one of the things that I wrote down for Link's Awakening was that it almost had too much detail sometimes. I thought
For the Game Boy screen?
Yeah, they tried to fit a lot in there, like all the grass detail and the little flowers and stuff like that, which is I can see where some people would think that's amazing, but for me, like looking at it, it was almost too busy sometimes.
You might have those 2 medium grays, we'll call them, but they're puke green or whatever. You might have those 2 medium grays expressing grass and right next to it also expressing a tree. Yeah.
So that was a little much. Maybe I felt like I could have done with a little less detail actually. And then it was also harder because I was playing on a non-color version.
You were playing
that
on a
made
Game
it
Boy
more
Advance
difficult, and so I could
no light.
put in a little color with a Game Boy Advance.
Yeah.
They're a little one color scheme, so to speak. But
Mm-hmm.
it would have been easier if I had a full color version. I think that
Certainly
had to do with it. I think that I would have had an easier time playing that game with
when
more
we
colors.
eventually review the Oracle games, I'm gonna maybe insist, even though I know I won't have to, that you play it on like a Game Boy Player or something up on a screen.
Sure.
I think you'll enjoy the experience much more. But anyway, to speak to that detail, I agree with you. I think that maybe the team that was coding Link's Awakening felt an obligation to maintain as much detail as they could from A Link to the Past. The sprites in Link's Awakening are different than in A Link to the Past. There are some sprites that are very close to being identical, but Link's graphics are different. They're certainly not the Link from the original Legend of Zelda. I think they are referencing Link's sprite from A Link to the Past, but it is a little bit more basic.
Yeah.
And I'm not speaking about the color remix yet of Link's Awakening. I don't think we'll even talk about that in this episode.
Okay.
But yeah, maybe you're right. I thought that the graphics in Link's Awakening, I actually think I enjoy them very much. I think on an old screen, it does get a little blurry, it does get a little weird, especially when you've got that bad refresh rate and stuff like that. Though by today's standards, going back and playing on a black and white setting on a Game Boy player is a pleasure for me.
I don't know. I like the look of Link to the Past so much more, which I've seen cartoony games on Game Boy games, and so this I felt went a little back from the cartoon.
Well, that's so fascinating that you bring that up, because you're absolutely right. There's a
Some
weird
of
thing
it, I
going on
guess.
with Link's Awakening. They are perhaps trying to put too much detail in so that put as much detail in as possible. Because it's coming off of, spiritually speaking, it's coming off of A Link to the Past. But at the same time, I think they were smart enough to know that some of those graphics need to be simplified.
Right.
And so we do get much simpler, the contrast on some of the sprites are increased.
The
That's
harsh
true.
edges are
Yeah.
back.
Yeah,
in
exactly.
some places, yeah.
So that might be by design as well.
Yeah. I wasn't turned off by it, except for when the screen was just way too busy with stuff. And I was trying to understand.
Fair enough. So then that was released in 1993. Then there was a bit of a drought for a while. I know that A Link to the Past lived on for many years. People continued to play it on the Super Nintendo. And finally in 1998, our first console experience came out. And let's definitely speak about this. And then I think maybe we'll go to break. Because this is kind of this is a turning point for the Zelda series.
Yes, absolutely.
So many of the games come after Ocarina, but Ocarina is canonically a turning point. It is in the real world certainly a benchmark.
Yep, all those things.
All the posts and the benches.
Yep.
And I think it's interesting and important. So, brand new engine, new system.
First 3D game.
What would you like to say about it?
So first with 3D graphics, which was obviously a very big deal. Everyone looked very pointy, which is part of that's what they could do was make everyone very pointy, right? What could they have made the people any?
They did some of the
less
shaders.
geometric?
Some of the shaders for the lighting helped the polygons mesh together a little bit, so you could see things like Link's hair would blend a little bit more accurately than something in. I can't help but think about like Metal Mario in Super Mario 64, where the shading is basically an entire polygon has a shading, or like back in the old like Virtua Racer games, totally different developers, totally different team. But you think about like Virtua Fighter, the 3D Virtua Fighter that Sega made. Every polygon can only take a single color.
Gotcha.
Not A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time was really good at. I remember them being very excited about lighting in that game.
Yeah.
And the lighting could affect polygons from one polygon to the next. So I think that helps smooth some of it out, but you're absolutely right. Link has a really pointy nose.
Yes, they're all very pointy. The landscapes all looked really cool to me. And I remember being really impressed by when the sun was setting, the colors were beautiful. And
that's part of that lighting. So the graphic of the sunsets, but the lighting engine or whatever, the lighting in the engine gets a little bit more orange. It's the first time we saw that. Link's shadows of his legs, which were just sprites that were distorted, get stretched out a little further, and they were always accurate to the light. That was really cool.
There's still texture in the grass, but it does not bug me as much.
Yeah.
It's obviously not as busy looking.
They started layering textures on top of each other. So like the paths in Hyrule Field are a separate polygon texture that's put on top of the polygons that are in the field. So that helps kind of blur the dirt to the grass look, stuff like that. That was kind of cool.
I remember at certain points just kind of taking Link's point of view and just kind of staring at the character in front of me and being like, huh.
That's what it looks
They
like.
look so interesting. Like, I remember the Gerudo thieves. I was like, oh,
Yes.
these are weird looking characters. But
Yeah.
I just like looking at all the detail that went into
And that
everything. It's
Gerudo
crazy.
aesthetic would be explored more like in Breath of the Wild. They kind of honor that aesthetic a little bit in Breath of the Wild, which is cool.
Absolutely.
I remember the river, Zora's River, was just artistically for me. I just loved that area. I loved going in there, and I felt like the water was real water. I felt like they did a great job of having moss on things and putting logs in the water and the waterfalls and the water, the way the water textures on the actual polygons would move were accurate to maybe how the water really would move, because they didn't have physics engines for water back then. They had to actually program in this texture should move along at this speed. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. This is stuff that, and this is why I wanted to talk to you about it, because you would have that perspective on all of this stuff. And I just kind of talk about what I think is pretty.
That's fine with me. I love it. That's what's so fun about doing this show with you. Let me ask you this. If you had to place the Ocarina of Time aesthetic. Now, right here in front of you, I see that you have some illustrations of Link in the Ocarina of Time style. What does it reference the most? Do you think it's going into A Link to the Past? Is it going to Zelda 2? Because from a game mechanic point of view, Miyamoto actually said that he used the adventure of Link as a reference for Ocarina of Time in many ways.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I would have noticed. I know his.
Hey, it's dingy. There are parts in Ocarina of Time that get quite dingy, like the Adventure of Link.
Okay, yeah, and also
dingy meaning dark colors, real colors. My sisters used to not want to play Ocarina because they said it was too scary and real looking.
Oh yeah, so yeah, when you're like down in the bottom of the well, that part is definitely darker. And also his hair is actually blonde in this game. I remember you saying before it was pink in previous games,
why.
or look brown in some of the older ones too. But they made him a true blonde. So.
Like technically in the original Legend of Zelda, Link's pupil is green because they could only have 4 colors to a sprite. But you can't really tell because of the way they mix the pixels. But anyway, in Super Nintendo, I don't know if there was any reason why they had to make it pink. Maybe they thought it was brown or something, or orange. But anyway.
Interesting.
So let's talk a little bit about, the artistic, the aesthetic of the characters in Ocarina of Time. They are slightly stylized. They are characterized.
Yes, they don't look like human beings.
Right, yeah.
Really
they are
at all.
caricatures.
Everything is like, a character, a creature, or something like that. No one really looks like a human necessarily.
Even like Malin and stuff, they
Kinda.
There's some accurate ratios of faces, but there's plenty of big noses and plenty of big tummies and plenty of other things.
And they really liked boobs in Ocarina of Time, honestly.
Yeah, that was a little weird.
Yeah.
That was kind of the time. That was at a time where video games, from that point of view, and we spoke to this a little bit in a previous episode, this is kind of in the early Tomb Raider days, where video games were doing that a little bit.
Big pointy boobs.
Yeah, a little
Between
weird.
the Great Fairy and
The thieves.
Nabooru, the Gerudo, and Princess Rudo also.
Princess Rudo?
I mean, a little bit. Older Princess Rudo.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Fair enough.
So that was odd. Like
Interesting.
when I was a kid playing this game, I was like, oh, that Great Fairy. I don't know if I like that one.
The Great Fairy was a little freaky as a
She's
kid.
a
I was
little-
kind of like, what? Am I supposed to be seeing what I think I'm seeing
Yeah.
here? Are these vines around a naked floating lady? Like,
Yeah, that part was a little vague. I wasn't really sure what was going on there.
Yeah. So I think in general, Ocarina of Time took a realistic tone in its graphics, but then slightly stylized the characters and
Right.
stuff.
Not quite, these are meant to look like actual people, or like it's
Yeah.
very still, I don't know. I don't want to say cartoonish, but it's definitely not real.
You're right. Well, you could believe it to be in a real world, but the stylization.
world looked real.
Yeah. Oh, kind of like Breath of the Wild, actually, where we still have slightly characterized characters. It's like, kind of come up with
I was
another
wondering
word.
where you were going to go with that
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah, but the lighting was super cool. It's the first time we really got real lighting.
Yeah.
A Link to the Past tried to emulate lighting. They would do like cool things with like modes of graphics that would have shadows going across the land of clouds would have shadows and stuff like that. There was a little bit of that in A Link to the Past. Let's take a break. And we're going to come back and we're going to, this might be a perfect bridge because, of course, the next game is Majora's Mask, which is an extension of the Ocarina engine, but some of the graphics are expressed very differently.
Yes.
Wonderful. So when we come back from our break here, we'll dive in with Majora's Mask.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Zelda podcast. I'm David Geisler here with Kate Fischer. And Kate, we just took a quick break, a brief break to catch our breath. And now we are talking about Majora's Mask, which came out in 2000. I think it was only about was it a year or 2 years? Let me look at my notes here. 98 is when Ocarina of Time came out. 2000, 2 years later was Majora's Mask. Now, Ocarina of Time came out, I think, like my senior year of high school. Or perhaps end of junior year. So by the time I was in my first year in college, that's when Majora's Mask came out. And I was so excited because I so enjoyed Ocarina that I pre-ordered Majora. I got the crazy little box with the art that did the 3D motion stuff on it. Which at the time I kind of didn't care about so much, but my Majora's Mask cartridge was gold and I was very excited about all of that. But I couldn't wait to get me some more Ocarina of Time, basically, is what Majora's Mask was for me.
And instead it was the Game of Nightmares.
Little did I know the mechanics would be so different. I've spoken in the past about how actually at that time I was kind of excited about new mechanics because I wanted more Ocarina, but
different.
Just a duplicate wasn't necessarily what I was feeling I needed. So for me, Majora's Mask was perfect. It was exactly what I was looking for. It ran the same engine as Ocarina of Time, but it had some, I guess you could say, upgrades. So I'm going to ask you, what's your interpretation of the graphics or the graphic style in Majora's Mask?
So the little that I've played, because this is the game that always frustrated me.
Because you hated it so much. How far did you actually ever get in Majora's Mask? It's okay did you get into the first temple dungeon? Did you get into like the Deku Swamp dungeon?
I don't even know if I got that far.
To the Deku Swamp?
I think I was so stuck in Clock Town and not being able to really save when I wanted to and not loving the time limit. I felt under pressure the whole time that I would just kind of start over and start over and start over and start over and quit and quit and quit and quit.
Yeah. The game opens up a smidge when you get out into Termania and the overworld. It's kind of like, I'm going to head towards one of the dungeons and it's going to take 3 game days to do that. Then you get to the dungeon and you save and you start over. And then it's going to take 3 game days to get through the dungeon is kind of what it starts turning into.
Okay.
So you feel that pressure a little. It starts feeling more like checkpoints than pressure.
Gotcha.
But I agree. The time thing was perhaps my least favorite thing about Majora's Mask, but the ability to have every NPC have a life and be programmed was worth it for me.
So it did look aesthetically similar to Ocarina in that people were still pointy, but there was a darkness to
it was darker. You're
everything.
right. The polygon count perhaps didn't change because they just used the same character models for Majora's Mask, but there was better lighting and there was better textures, and they were actually getting into that space where they could add textures on top of textures inside a single polygon. So you would get things like a tree texture and it would fade from brown to green or red or whatever. And it was technically that was a variation off of a lighting mechanic that they had built. So like you could have a red light in the corner of a room and the polygons around it would express that red light as a gradient, even though it was already on top of like a stone texture. See where I'm going with this?
Yep.
But that did require extra RAM to process that. And that's why you did need the expansion pack to play Majora's Mask.
Okay. Yeah, I remember it looking like Ocarina of Time, but plussed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
a little bit more lighting and much more texture. And so then you would start to see things like, okay, we're going to have a small repeating texture with large textures put on top. In fact, in some places, I liked the added texture because I felt like it did kind of blend a lot of polygon work together. You see the edges of the polygons less by seeing more textures, but sometimes it almost felt like they were getting a little crazy with it too.
I just remember the moon scaring the bejesus out of me. That's my main takeaway from this game. But the characters are still characters. They're not human. It looked very similar to Ocarina of Time. So
yeah, I don't think, for example, like the crew that's building the stuff in the town. I don't know if they had more textures on them. It was really the world work.
Yeah.
Was a little bit
I
more
agree.
detailed.
Yep.
And more lighting. The thing was, there's some other stuff that we could talk about in the artistic direction of Majora's Mask. There was the first time we started using like a shuttered frame rate in some of his flashbacks. They would get the blurry frame rate thing where they could
I have to play that game.
cycle. And that was interesting because I think that was not, I could be mistaken, but I think that was not an on-screen filter effect the way some things are done these days. I think that they actually figured out a way to rack the opacity on polygons to make it look like something was blurring. So they, instead of having one hand move across the screen, they could have 10 hands that would have a varying opacity value so that it looked like it was blurring. I think that's how they did it, but I could be mistaken.
Cool. And all the character designs are pretty much the same too. No one really changed in the look of the characters, Gorons, Zoras, etc.
The most I can think of is those the key masks that you wear when you turn into a Zora, when you turn into a Goron, when you turn into a Deku Scrub. They had a bit more detail. They were new character models, you could say.
Okay, I see what you're talking about. Yep.
So it was cool.
I'm looking through my book because I have
I
not
love it.
played
This
that
book is
much
beautiful.
of that game.
Well, let's keep moving here. What it takes us to an interesting time now. Now an interesting thing happens. About a year later, Capcom, this is the behind the scenes of the Oracle series, a quick overview of the Oracle series. Capcom had a pretty good relationship with Nintendo because, they just were building a pretty good relationship with Nintendo. That would be later realized by having a 5-game deal to be GameCube exclusive, including Resident Evil 4 and Killer 7 and a couple other games. A few of them were realized, a few of them weren't. Beautiful Joe was in that series. That hasn't been realized yet, but it was on the horizon. But predating that, Capcom was creating a nice relationship with Nintendo. And they approached Nintendo and said, could we... as legend would have it, because I'm not sourcing something specifically right now, but this is the knowledge that I think to be accurate and true. Capcom approached Nintendo and said, could we remake The Legend of Zelda for Game Boy? We would like to just take The Legend of Zelda and give it a sprite overhaul and kind of rework the mechanics and translate it too. You know, something that, interestingly enough, was not the inspiration for Link's Awakening for Game Boy. Link's Awakening's inspiration was the Super Nintendo game.
Okay.
You know? So Capcom said...
so many threads.
I know. So Capcom said, can we rebuild it? Nintendo said, cool. Play around. Here are the sprites from Link's Awakening. Work with that and let's see what you can do. Let's see if we want to remake The Legend of Zelda as almost using the Link's Awakening sprite base.
Okay.
Oh, it wasn't just for Game Boy. It was for Game Boy Color specifically because Nintendo was making the Game Boy Color. The Game Boy Color came out at a weird time. It came out at a time where next-gen systems were already starting to come out. Remember, the Game Boy Advance kind of came out late. The Color came out at a time when I think the Game Boy Color... Oh, yeah, the Game Boy Color and the Nintendo 64 were side by side for a while there.
That's crazy to think
You know
about.
what I mean? Isn't that weird? So Nintendo was really excited to celebrate the colors. They obviously did a Link's Awakening recolor with the DX system. So as Capcom was working on the Game Boy Color mod, I guess, of the original Legend of Zelda, it very quickly started to evolve into its own game. So much so that Miyamoto approached them or between Miyamoto and Capcom, it was decided that maybe they would actually create their own original story. Nintendo was liking the direction that Capcom was taking this. And Nintendo said, that's cool. We really are hungry for more handheld games anyway. Make some games. And it was decided that they would make 3 games, one for each part of the Triforce, a power, a wisdom, whatever.
Okay.
And that these games would be connected to each other because also Nintendo wanted to celebrate the Game Link cable, which was also being used in games like Pokemon and stuff like that. So they said, okay, let's Pokemon Legend of Zelda a little bit and make it so you can share stuff or at least share story parts. Eventually, that was a huge task. Capcom was doing a great job, but they pared it down to just 2. They took it away from the Triforce and said, well, what are things that express color? Now, this is where we get back to the artistic style.
Yeah.
Or making aesthetic choices because of the hardware. So the strength in the Game Boy Color was it was 8-bit still. It had a slightly better processor, but it had the color screen, of course.
Yes.
So what are some cool ways to express color? Maybe the passing of seasons. Maybe, it's doing time travel. Things can get aged. The sprite is the same, but it's dingier in the olden time, or cleaner in the olden times and dingier in the modern times. Certainly, Oracle of Seasons makes perfect sense to me. We're going to have snow colors, fall colors, autumn colors, spring colors. We can just do palette shifts and really show off the color changing in these systems. So what Capcom did is they absolutely 100% took the sprites from Link's Awakening and brought them into their games. Kind of there's a loose Majora's Mask Ocarina of Time suggestion there, or a connection, you know. Let's take that thing. Now, one thing that Capcom did do is because the processor on the Game Boy Color was a little stronger, they could do 8-direction, what I've been calling 8-direction scrolling. And so when you're in the overworld in the Oracle series, you still have your screen-by-screen scrolling that was also realized in Link's Awakening. But when you go into the temples and the dungeons, you actually get to scroll in all 8 directions. And a dungeon room is bigger than a single screen. So when you played Link's Awakening, some of those dungeon rooms, they get tight.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Imagine now them being,
limited.
I guess you could say 4 times as big or twice as big. Four screens worth is actually one room now in the Game Boy Color series, which I think when you do play these games, you're going to enjoy that quite a bit.
I was going to say, just looking at it, I think I would enjoy it more. It's so much easier to just looking at it. It would be so much easier to navigate because there are different shades of different textures and it's not just like flat and
so from
a bunch of detail.
Artistic point of view, we could almost say that this thread is actually still in the Link's Awakening, Link to the Past thread of art style.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And also now in the Oracle series, they do have all that texture and detail still in the grass and the trees and the whatever, but because of the colors, it's a little easier
It's easier to see. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's a little clear looking.
So the Oracle series were considered a success. Also, by the way, because we're post Ocarina of Time, Capcom went ahead and included Gorons in these stories. They included the Zora in these stories. And so all of a sudden you started seeing Ocarina elements come into a handheld system.
I think that was why I was confused when I went from Ocarina backwards to kind of look at the Nintendo, Super Nintendo games, because I was like, where's everything?
Where's everything?
I figured that it had been the same from day one. You know? It was not.
There are Zoras in the very first The Legend of Zelda. They're the river Zoras and stuff like that.
Right.
And there is mention of Zoras in Link's Awakening. There's like a Zora scale, or there's some item you get that I think might have a Zora name connected to it.
But it wasn't
to my knowledge,
the same.
To my knowledge, Gorons were pretty much invented with Ocarina of Time. I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that's where they started. And anyway, also one final cool thing that we saw from an artistic choice was that in Ocarina of Time, the text is often colored. If there's a proper noun or a thing you should pay attention to, it might be colored red or blue or whatever. So in the dialogue in the Oracle series, also the appropriate words are colored.
Nice.
So it does spiritually feel more like an Ocarina game on a Game Boy.
I should try those out. I wrote down, it's funny that you mentioned Pokemon earlier being like a similar game, because I was looking at like images from this game and I'm like, why are there Pokemon in this game? Like,
so there kind of are. There are characters and creatures that you ride. It happens here and there. Yes, it's true. And that might have been, that I can imagine that being something like Capcom coming and saying, wait, like you did Epona in Ocarina. We'd like to do mounts. We'd like to do something. And maybe they figured out they couldn't quite do a horse, but if they do a squatty Stegosaurus looking dragon, they can.
Or a kangaroo.
Or a kangaroo. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah, the mounts. I thought I had more to say about that.
It was just odd to me. It's like, oh, that's an interesting choice.
Well, and then now this is where it starts getting weird, because a year later on Game Boy Advance, Four Swords comes out. Now, Four Swords. Oh, do you know what? I might have my notes mixed up. In my opinion, okay. All right. I am not sure how to talk about this. I would rather recognize that Wind Waker came out first, because in my opinion, Four Swords references the Wind Waker art style. These games might have been in development at the same time, and they came out the same year. It might be debatable as to exactly when which one came out, but for the sake of our conversation, let's discuss Wind Waker next. Would you be comfortable with that?
I am okay with that. Actually, in the book that that was my inspiration for this whole thing.
Yeah.
Wind Waker does come first.
Wonderful.
In the book. So
wonderful. Let's do that. So now we have, Ocarina has been out there for a while. Majora's Mask, it's been years, many, many years. GameCube is happening. We've had our 2 Zelda games on Nintendo 64. We've had 2 games on Game Boy Color, which I remember playing the heck out of those Oracle series. I was in college and they sufficed, let's say, from a quality point of view. You know what I mean? So we go into Wind Waker. I was talking a lot
And-
there for the handhelds, and I know that you know a little bit more about the console releases, so why don't you introduce this game?
The world turned upside down and everyone went crazy.
Whoa! Interesting.
Basically, I think.
Ooh, tell me.
It's so divisive. Some people love Wind Waker. Some people hate Wind Waker.
Okay.
Because of the look of it.
Yes.
I don't know, people that hate it maybe think it didn't take Zelda seriously enough and turned it into a cartoon. I'm not really sure. I'm one of the camp that loves this game because of how different it is.
In retrospect, I enjoy the aesthetic. I had a hard time with it initially.
Okay. See, I tuned into it right away. I was like, yep, I'm on board. I'm on board with this.
I mean, I thought the cell shading was awesome. I thought it was really well executed, but I remember reading a press release. It was just before Mario Sunshine came out as well, when the GameCube was getting started. GameCube was a weird time for Nintendo. They just tried different things with everything. They were like, let's take Metroid and give it to a second party and turn it into a first-person shooter. Let's make Mario more realistic. And what I mean by that is they gave him actual jeans. He wore actual jeans with like texture on it, and he went to a town with houses and slanted buildings on Delfino Island. And there was, and so this press release was like, Mario's going to become more realistic, and Zelda's going to become more cartoony. And I was like, no. That is the opposite of what I want coming out of Nintendo 64.
Sure.
You
And
know?
I think a lot of people felt that
like,
way,
I want
but I was
Mario.
like, nope, I'm into it. I love the GameCube. I really do.
So I think that the cell shaded style from a behind the scenes perspective was a way to have the world be physically or literally bigger in Wind Waker without having to render as much, because at a certain point this background can just be all blue or this background can just be all green.
Yeah.
And you're not rendering all these textures and stuff.
It's just so bright and colorful, and to me, looking at it even now, I'm just like, wow, like everything just looks so cool. I love the animations of the smoke, the curly Q smoke. I honestly love the way the water looks because of its simplicity.
It is beautiful.
It is. It's just, I don't know what draws me to it so much, but it's a style I really, really liked.
I'm completely on board. And it didn't take long. I think the first time I played it, the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, why are we doing this? Why does Link look like Bart Simpson mixed with Sonic the Hedgehog? Like,
Sure.
I didn't quite get it. And I actually, there was another thing that I'm just recalling now that Miyamoto was very excited about when they decided to go with the cell shaded route, probably for a technical reason, probably so they could render further, because they were trying to make, they couldn't make Hyrule Field bigger, but they could make a big empty ocean bigger and then just load things as they go, right? And that's one of the criticisms, is that it's a bit sparse, but we don't have to talk about that in this episode. But one of the things that Miyamoto was getting very excited about, if I may speak for him, was that they had figured out the way for Link to have conditional contextual awareness. So in Ocarina of Time, there was contextually sensitive action items with the buttons. But here now, Link, if he saw a treasure chest, he would look at it. If an enemy was nearby, he'd look up at it.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. His eyes, look in
Sorry.
different directions.
Absolutely. You're 100% right. I'm sorry. I was just kind of going, but please interrupt me at any point. And so Miyamoto said, well, if we're going to go, well, he didn't say this, but it was, you could make the connection that if we're going to go in a cartoony route, let's make Link's eyes humongous, because this is a new technology we decided, and we want to use it as a game mechanic. The idea that Link looks up at a treasure or looks down at something, even if your camera angle isn't in the right spot, you are informed as to where some of this stuff might be.
Yeah. I had just totally forgotten about it. That's why I had to exclaim, because I was like, oh, yeah, I do remember that. That was a really cool mechanic of that game.
In fact, there's a really cute little thing that I discovered in the HD remake, but also I found when I was diving in the beginning of making this show with the original GameCube Wind Waker, is when Link's doing his side saddle thing along walls. If you just touch the control stick a little, his eyes move first.
Oh.
And you can get him to just look left and right if you just barely move that control stick. It's
cool.
really super cool.
And so obviously with this new technology and the new system, everyone is less pointy too, which is nice. Everything became a lot more round.
So,
like they almost over rounded.
Well, you're absolutely right.
everything.
And that's fascinating, because that is a perfect example of how the polygon count didn't necessarily increase in Wind Waker. It did to some degree, but it was more about the shaders and how they would blend the polygons together with shading and literal shaders or actual shaders. So they could still have these character models that didn't have a million polygons, kabillion polygons, but they could still look quite nice.
Yeah.
Because if you were to take out all the effects, all the cell shaded effects in Wind Waker, I think we would shockingly find that there are fewer polygons than it may look. Like it may look
Interesting.
closer to Ocarina than we realize.
I think just the cell shading and the shapes and styles of the characters work so well together. I just love Wind Waker so much.
That's cool. I'm on board. And I will say that like as soon as I started playing Wind Waker, and I felt Link jump off a ledge correctly, so to speak, correctly in quotes based on Ocarina, and I felt him move correctly, and I felt him battle correctly, I was like, oh no, this is Zelda.
Yeah.
This is the Zelda engine or whatever. This is still definitely like, I wouldn't be surprised if they took if they literally copy and pasted some of the numbers for some of the variables, for some of the algorithms for jumping and moving and all that, because it feels almost identical to some of the stuff that happens in Ocarina, and that's great.
I would like to know for people that are listening what their opinions are on Wind Waker, because it is so divisive. Like, are you in the team love, or are you in the team hate, and why?
And also Wind Waker, you can tweet us at ZeldaPod if you want to let us know, or if you're watching on YouTube or listening to us if you're listening to us on iTunes, tweet us. But if this is Facebook or YouTube, send a comment, put a comment down below. But this is also a turning point aesthetically from an artistic direction for the rest of the series as well.
Yes.
Perhaps the cell shading was created because they wanted to stretch the GameCube as far as possible. Something we'll also see in Skyward Sword, by the way. This defined an art style, which is expressed in the next game we're going to talk about here.
Yeah.
So the next thing that happened was Game Boy Advance had come out. It was essentially a 16-bit system. No. It might have been 32. No. It was 16. It was roughly a 16-bit system, so it was similar to a Super Nintendo, the Game Boy Advance, as far as its like power and rendering abilities. And so, to complement Wind Waker, another game came out called Four Swords, and I thought it was called Four Sword Adventures, but maybe that is the GameCube mix. But what do you have in your notes here? What does that say? I think it's just Four Swords.
Book says Four Swords, but I remember hearing Four Swords Adventures too.
That might be the GameCube one that came out a little bit later, which is also kind of fun. So Four Swords.
That one I hadn't played for some reason. I don't.
Which one?
Like the GameCube one, because I had a GameCube and I had Wind Waker, and by that time I was, into Zelda, but for some reason I missed.
The GameCube Four Swords came out right around the time that like Pac-Man Versus was coming out, and Nintendo was getting real hot about having you plug your Game Boys into your GameCubes. They were getting very excited about that. I have played Four Swords for the GameCube, which is a different game than Four Swords for Game Boy Advance.
Interesting.
And it was very fun. It's a little weird because you actually play levels in it. And and at the end, there's different scoring and stuff. It's not just an overworld. But it was cool. And I suspect Four Swords for Game Boy Advance is a game that I have not played and you have not either. That's why I think it would be really fun for us to play it together.
Yeah.
And even though ideally you play it with 4 people, maybe just the 2 of us playing is enough for us to extrapolate.
But we don't have 2 other friends anyway, so.
Not at all.
It wouldn't work.
It's really about finding 4 cartridges. Is what it comes down to. Because in Four Swords Adventures...
Tricky, Nintendo.
Four Swords Adventures, to my knowledge, you need a cartridge in every single system. I think.
Everyone has to buy 4 games. Give me money.
Fair enough, a little bit. Well, and some of that is true. Like, they did try to, like with Mario Kart on the Game Boy Advance, they tried to allow you to play single cartridge multiplayer, and there were a couple tracks that were small enough that you would actually port it over to the RAM inside the other Game Boy Advance, and then you could play together. But if the tracks were bigger and they needed to source that memory out of the multiple cartridges, that's what would happen. Four Swords Adventures, I'm sure. I'm trying to get us back to artistic styles. And so in Four Swords Adventures, it is intuitively obvious. It is the weirdest thing. It is a clear mashup of the world being that of Link's Awakening graphics and the characters clearly being interpretation of the Wind Waker graphics.
Yeah. How bizarre.
Any thoughts?
Not many, because I haven't played the game.
Yeah.
I just thought it was interesting that they continued with the Wind Waker after everyone had, I'm sure they had heard the feedback, which was just like general, I don't know how I feel about this style. So I find it interesting that they continued with it as much as they did, the Wind Waker.
I suspect that if we're trying to kind of reverse engineer this, if you're a team trying to build the next handheld Legend of Zelda, you and I in this episode have already discussed that it's a tricky thing. You want to bring in detail, but you also need your characters to be simple so that they can be easily seen on this teeny tiny little screen. And certainly the Game Boy Advance screen was better than the Game Boy Color screen, which was certainly better than the normal Game Boy screen. But with that said, I think this simple colors, thick black lines,
big shapes
lends itself to less pixels very nicely.
Sure.
And so I'm sure that that's what happened. And that's why. And we start to see that trend happen in all handheld games. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, with the exception of Link Between Worlds, we keep the Wind Waker aesthetic through all handheld games.
That's what I think I was finding as well when doing some research.
Yeah, it's interesting. So anyway, we'll keep moving from there. Four Swords Adventures, or Four Swords, which will be fun. That came out in 2002, basically along with Wind Waker. A couple years later, a game comes out for the handheld system. So we kind of have two handheld systems in a row, but made by two different teams. It's my understanding that Nintendo created Four Swords. I could be mistaken, but I believe that internally they made that one. So it might have been like a similar team, that not the same team that worked on Link's Awakening, but I think Four Swords was done by Nintendo. Now I'm starting to wonder. But I know for sure that the team, or Capcom rather, that made the two Oracle series, they went ahead and made the Minish Cap.
Ah, okay.
So that is also a Capcom Nintendo joint, so to speak.
Gotcha.
The Minish Cap, I am in the middle of playing it right now. I'm just about to beat it.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the one that you were on.
Yeah, I've been open about saying that I'm playing it because I'm also listening to Tandem Legends and they're playing it right now. So I'm having a lot of fun playing it along with them. And I think, Kate, I have not reached out to the two people that do the Tandem Legends podcast yet, but I think I might reach out to them and invite them to come on this show when we do our Minish Cap review episode.
Cool. Sounds good.
Maybe we can Skype them in or something. Would you be comfortable with that?
Absolutely.
It might be an episode where I know you haven't played this game at all, and it might be an episode where you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Happy to listen.
Okay, cool. Wonderful. Because we're going to be spending enough time playing other games. So in the Minish Cap, we absolutely return to, it's also a Game Boy Advance game. We return to the Wind Waker graphics. The something that's interesting about Minish Cap is that we have, I already told you that the big gimmick in Minish Cap is that you change your size. So sometimes you're a teeny tiny little character and you're this little tiny Picori styled character, and sometimes you're a normal human size or whatever, we'll just say. I don't know if they're actually called humans. So sometimes what happens is you see your overworld, which is an extension. I can tell it's a new graphic style. It's an extension off of what was happening in the Oracle series, but it is a new art style. Capcom probably created new assets for the overworld in Minish Cap. However, we get another thing. So sometimes you're playing in a normal sized town or a normal sized view with a teeny tiny 3-pixel little Link character, but sometimes the screen zooms in and now Link is rendered, it goes Honey, I Shrunk the Kids on you.
Okay.
Link is rendered normal size, but then everything around is huge.
Yeah.
And
like these clovers I'm looking at.
When everything around is huge, the art style changes a little bit too, and it becomes kind of a hand-drawn style.
Yeah, it does. I'm looking at pictures right now because I hadn't played this game before, but that looks cool.
Whereas when you're zoomed out in the overworld, it's a little more sprite-based.
Yep. I see exactly what you're talking about. Cool.
Kinda
I really
cool, right?
like that hand-drawn kind of style. It's
Yeah, they're really, so up to this point, the handheld games have been very grid-based. You know, you kind of see that, oh, we're still building the world with grids and sprites that fit into a grid. Even in the Oracle games that happened, and even a little bit in Four Swords. In this game, I think it is technically maybe still grid-based under the hood, but aesthetically, that really starts to disappear.
I like it. Now I want to play this game too.
It's very good, and I'm actually having a blast playing it again.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Also, something we see in the Minish Cap is we start seeing kind of pseudo 3D effects. There are some twisty Mode 7 things. Famously, in the very first forest dungeon, there's a barrel that you go into and it rolls, and they use a Mode 7 effect to make this barrel look like it's rolling and stuff like that. Cool. They use Mode 7 effects to make sprites grow and shrink because, of course, you are growing and shrinking. And so that's a place where the technology of the system or the abilities of the system was able to inform the design.
This is kind of where, I feel like I'd get on board more with this than like.
So I have a confession. When we've started this podcast and I said, oh, you got to play some of the handheld games, I was torn because I actually wanted you to play Minish Cap first because I felt it would be the one you'd probably enjoy the most. But I also was kind of like, I don't want to punish Kate, but I think she needs to appreciate the evolution of the handheld game. So let's give her Link's Awakening first. It's actually probably the hardest one to play because of the restraints of the system, which is what you experienced, certainly. And we talked about that in our episode, but it only gets better from here. And so maybe we play the Oracle games, but Minish Cap's wonderful. It's very good.
So you're a video game sadist, basically. You wanted to put me...
Well, I don't know.
Through difficulty.
Like you will really experience. Yeah, I guess right. I guess that's.
Thanks
I don't know.
a lot.
But thanks for playing. But see, also Link's Awakening is such a monumental game.
True.
In the series,
I can take it for what it is. Definitely, even if it didn't, connect with me personally, I totally understand.
Right.
But no, I was looking at these pictures from Minish Cap, and even the grid style
like
view,
layout or whatever.
the
yeah.
layout looks just more easy to interpret and understand because the technology is there where there are you can tell where the edges of things are, like cliffs. You can tell where the cliffs are. It's
Yes,
very clear.
absolutely. I would say that if Four Swords almost directly lifts world sprites from A Link to the Past, Minish Cap kind of reinterprets those sprites. I think that Minish Cap has an art style that was probably created organically at the Capcom studio. I even think that the rendering of Link in the Wind Waker art style, I think the pixels are technically different than the pixels of the Wind Waker style Links in Four Swords.
And I would have no idea.
Well, let's transition to something you know a lot about.
Oh boy.
The next game to come out is in 2006, so a couple years go by, and Twilight Princess is released.
Oh man.
I was incredibly excited. Okay, so in hindsight, I have grown to really enjoy the Wind Waker aesthetic. But honestly, when Nintendo announced that they were going to create a quote-unquote realistic-looking Zelda, quite frankly, kind of in response to fan reaction to Wind Waker. I mean, they were making another Zelda anyway, but they chose to go very realistic with it. I think it's not a secret that it was largely based on fan reaction to Wind Waker.
Sure.
I was so excited.
Yeah.
I was so excited. So why don't you talk a little bit about Twilight Princess? And also, I want to ask you, with the knowledge we have of Zelda 2 and Ocarina and Wind Waker and cartoony type experiences and realistic experiences, why don't you tell me a little bit about your thoughts on Twilight Princess? And I'm asking you if any connections to previous games come to mind. So if I may, let's do art style first.
Yeah. So complete 180 to Wind Waker, complete 180 to then Twilight Princess from Wind Waker, completely different.
Right.
I love the more realistic look. It was a darker game. It was like, okay, Zelda's now growing up finally with the people that are playing the game.
Right. I think I said in a previous episode, I had a friend that said, I like that the spiders are actually scary in this one.
Yeah.
Whereas they were definitely not scary in Wind Waker.
No, nothing was.
Oh my gosh, I just realized something. My sisters, who are wonderful people, didn't really want to play Ocarina because it was too dingy. They did want to play Wind Waker, and they didn't want to play Twilight.
The theme makes sense. Makes sense. But there's also, I wouldn't say cartoonish. There's softer elements of Twilight Princess. It's not just dark; it's also beautiful. It's so soft and dreamy, but there are these hard edges mixed in with it. Like anything coming from the Twilight realm, they're literal squares floating through the air in this soft, floaty, dreamlike. There's so much like sunset type colors in this game, and then you have
thematically appropriate with the Twilight.
Yes, theme. Obviously, and then you have these dark, geometric shapes interacting with it, and that's
and they're largely blue and black to contrast the orange. Anyway, pardon me.
No, exactly. So that's one of the many reasons this game really just stuck out to me and I really liked it and really appreciated it. As to going back to an old game style, I don't know. What are you...
Is it referencing anything? No, I wasn't leading you into anything. I was genuinely trying to ask, like, where can we kind of try to deduce Nintendo's mindset when they were trying to decide this art style? I mean, I kind of felt like it was the more realistic version of Ocarina when it came out.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, it's probably what Ocarina was hoping and trying to do.
Twilight Princess, for me, aesthetically, was what Ocarina was in my imagination.
Sure.
In some ways. Yeah. And that's actually a good point now that I think about it. One of the reasons I liked Twilight... So one of the things that I like about Zelda games the most is I like, the large overarching puzzles, but at the end of the day, I want to feel immersed in the game.
Yes.
And Ocarina happens and you can get immersed, but you're always using that little brain translator of like, oh, that's just a triangle, but it's actually a tree stump.
Yeah.
So in my imagination, it's a tree stump.
Yep.
And then Wind Waker could render stuff slightly real, but it was like, oh, that's a blue blob, but it's actually water. So it was an artistic choice.
Right.
So in my imagination, it's water. Finally, with Twilight Princess, I remember those opening scenes and walking around Ordon Village, and I was like,
I'm in here.
I was thinking that tree stump is a tree stump.
Yeah.
This is, I want to go to there. I want to be in here.
I want to go to there.
These
people look like people.
Yeah.
As
mildly
close to people
stylized.
That they could get. Yeah.
But still, they looked real.
Really not a lot. Yeah. There is one thing that no one understands what eyebrows look like. in this game. Everyone's
Yeah, you're
eyebrows are really weird.
They're tiny or they're strangely shaped. That is a good point. I wonder why.
So everyone looks a little off because of that. The expressions are often really exaggerated. So that's part of not a realistic element to this game.
Yeah, the characters are the least realistic because they're the most stylized, but that's kind of akin to the Ocarina of Time thing.
Yeah, and there's so much detail to their outfits that this is another game where I would just kind of stare at the characters and just look at what they're wearing and look at all the pieces of what they look like.
This is a game that I would go into first person mode, like you kind of joked with Ocarina, and just look at the scenery.
Just look, there's so many that look so different from each other. I mean, you have Yetis in this game.
That's true.
You have townspeople, you have the Gorons, you have the Zoras. They're just the same cast of characters plus so many more interesting looking
It's
ones.
true. And as you mentioned the Gorons and the Zoras, I can't help but think about like the Zoras specifically. Not only were they rendered slightly more realistically, we're starting to see more attention to the character models. And what I mean by that is more detail. The character models are wearing clothes or jewelry and or shields and things like that.
It's not just a naked fish body.
Naked fish body, right. Or a naked rock body, which is basically what was going on in Ocarina.
Right.
We're seeing a lot more detail being not just rendered, but built. Like artists are building these assets.
Yeah. Queen Rutella looks more like a human than a Zora, which I had remembered reading about when I was
everything
Twilight
felt real
Princess
again.
stuff. But yeah, I love this game. I wanted to talk about the design of the sages, which is so bizarre. Like, where do you think that came from even? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it was kind of, it's interesting with the sages because it was the one place. It was the one place where I don't think that they were referencing Wind Waker, but it was the one place where they really let like the cell shading happen again and kind of let things be flat. And maybe that was in an effort to make it feel ethereal and not of that world a little bit. I thought the sages some of them were beautiful, but they were also just a little scary.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were imposing.
Yeah, so we have the animal sages, but then we also have the humanoid.
Oh, that's true.
Ones.
I forgot about that.
And the humanoid ones are the ones that were really bizarro, where they had like the kind of mask face.
Oh, yeah, that was trippy.
Yeah.
Kind of calls back to the end of Majora's Mask for me when we had all the crazy giants with the masks and the kids running around on the moon with the masks and stuff.
Okay, see, I was going to see if that's why I asked you, because I wanted to see if that was really kind of referring back to a previous game. Because to me, seeing the design of this sage I was like, what on earth is this?
I would say that there might be a bit of a Majora's Mask inspiration, but I don't think it's necessarily a reference.
Okay.
And we see some of that mask work later too in some of the other characters. But anyway, that's great.
In terms of enemies, holy cow, are they scarier. like you said, your friend said, the spiders look like spiders. These the creatures from the Twilight were
lifted straight out of Metroid Prime 2, but I don't want to talk about it.
Oh, really? Okay.
There's a similar aesthetic. I think it might have been like those games were being developed at the same time. It might have been an accident a little bit.
Well, okay. But they're creepy.
Oh, by accident, I just mean like, I'm creatively inspired, and everyone was thinking the same thing at the same time.
Gotcha. And okay, so Twilight Princess. I'm trying to think forward from that because I don't recall seeing enemies in that kind of, we're going to purposely make these freaky.
Yeah.
Since then.
Right. No, they've only gotten less freaky.
Yeah. I don't want Zelda to get too dark, but.
Well, I think that Breath of the Wild has found a wonderful medium where the world is realized very realistically. And the characters are slightly stylized. Oh, wow, that just lines up with Twilight Princess and Ocarina. That is a similar kind of thing there. So what happened was, then we go to Phantom Hourglass for the DS. We should keep moving because I think we're taking a little bit of time here, which is awesome. This is awesome, but we still have another episode to record today,
I know, that's true.
We got to get to it. However, wait, I can't help it. I see in your book here the Goron character that looks like it's straight out of Lord of the Rings, the fire character.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
It was scary.
I know.
When that boss ignites. I was, when the visuals can give you an emotional response that affect your ability to play the game, that's when it's done right.
I think that's why I like Twilight Princess so much, because that's the game that did that the most.
I would agree. I would agree very much. Not much needs to be translated visually. So then what happened was we have the DS come out and Phantom Hourglass is released, and it is frankly basically a sequel to Wind Waker. And I think it's narratively a sequel, and well, of course in the Zelda timeline it does come after on one of the chains after Ocarina. But
this is another one that I did not play, unfortunately.
Well, I did play it, and I was just excited about playing it on the DS. It was, from a mechanics point of view, it was slightly controversial because you use the pen to move Link. It's all pen work.
Oh, okay.
The whole thing is done with pens. Actually, you can use the shoulder buttons as hotkeys, and you could use the directional pad as hotkeys a little bit. But you could also play the entire game just with the pen.
Interesting. I never had a DS.
I never had a DS. This is a situation where I think very much the Wind Waker style helps the aesthetic. We're on a screen. We're on a handheld screen again. We want clear images. But what's kind of fun is whereas the Game Boy Advance games were artistically referencing the Wind Waker style, this is a place where now Phantom Hourglass is on a system strong enough to render polygons and render 3D engines that they actually just ran a cell shade engine in 3DS. So technically legitimate cell shading is happening in that 3DS engine. The black lines that are rendered around the side edge of a character are being rendered in engine and stuff like that.
Cool.
So some of the textures are have lower pixel counts and things, but ultimately, if you squinted, it almost looks like you're playing Wind Waker.
Okay.
You know?
Cool.
I don't know. We could talk about that a little bit more, but it's basically just Wind Waker.
Yeah, exactly.
From an artistic point of view, it is literally Wind Waker realized on a virtual system, not like I just said, the Game Boy things that are referencing that. So let's keep moving forward. And the next thing that comes up is Skyward Sword. I was a little disappointed to see the art style in Skyward Sword when I saw it in some of these like Nintendo expos that release stuff, because I felt like they were going back towards the Wind Waker look a little bit.
I didn't mind it. I liked the watercolor kind of look to it all. It was like you had said, I think this is in our last episode, where it was meant to look like you were in a painting, and it did. I like super colorful, but it was a different kind of colorful than Wind Waker. There were definitely so many more nuances of those colors, and everything was so many combinations of colors that I really liked the look of it, honestly.
Now, Skyward Sword comes out on a system, the Wii, that is not significantly more powerful than a GameCube. I've heard engineers jokingly say that the Wii was an Xbox and a GameCube duct taped together. And to some degree it was. Like, it had two different chip bases, and that's why you could just run GameCube games, because it would just use like the equivalent of a GameCube chip that was in there. And so it was kind of hard to code for a little bit to get power out of it. And so there were a lot of restrictions in the Wii's ability to process things. So I do, as I said previously, I think the aesthetic style, similar to the GameCube using cell shading to be able to stretch the abilities further or to deal with the constraints of the system, Skyward Sword made similar choices. My disappointment in Skyward Sword is that in Wind Waker, you kind of can't see the polygons. Or you can, but you're supposed to. Like, of course, the edge of the cliff is a hard line because it's Wind Waker and it's supposed to look like a cartoon.
Yeah.
In Skyward Sword, it was like, cool, you're doing the blur effect thing, which I had mixed responses to. Sometimes it was beautiful, sometimes it was a blurry mess. But I'd be running around in the forest, and I felt like I was playing Ocarina again sometimes. Sometimes the polygon count was so low on the edge of a cliff or something, or that, they were doing like a lot of the same shortcuts they would do in Ocarina, where let's just do a hard corner, but then put like a 2D grass sprite on it. And so from one direction it looks like grass, but from the other direction you can see the polygons. And that was a disappointment for me.
I don't pay attention to that. So I'm busy looking at kind of like the overall art style and the colors and everything. So yeah, that's something that I did notice.
I felt that Skyloft was rendered pretty well. I thought it was built, aesthetically, like it looked pretty beautiful.
Yeah. I really liked Fee's coloring, that kind of cool blue, purple. Yeah. I liked her look a lot.
They did kind of a pseudo cell shade thing on her too.
A little bit. Yep. She was more.
Actually, all the characters still have a light cell shading to them. They just don't have the black lines around them. But the way they render the shadows, which they do to this day in Breath of the Wild, is technically kind of more of a cell shaded technology.
Gotcha. I don't know. Just looking through the book that I have here, everyone is just so dang colorful, and it's so beautiful. Like where the game play lacked. I feel I really liked the artistic style that they chose.
That's wonderful.
Personally.
For me, I couldn't help but feel like it was a step backwards in a couple ways. Not just artistically, because it's not like Twilight Princess good, Wind Waker bad. It's not that for me, because Wind Waker has its own style too. What I didn't like about Skyward Sword is like, oh, it's somewhere in the middle, and
Like
for
it couldn't
me,
decide.
it was the lesser of both.
I gotcha.
You know.
It couldn't decide what it really wanted to be.
A little bit. And actually, I'd heard that Breath of the Wild was going to still kind of go in a mildly cel-shaded route, and I was a little worried. But I think that, okay, here we go. Breath of the Wild is the right way to is the better of both halves.
Gotcha.
For me, Skyward Sword was the lesser of both halves. But anyway.
Also, things got a little cartoony again. Looking back through this, the bosses were a little, definitely less scary than Twilight Princess.
The proportions of the body parts were definitely back into a cartoony style.
Yep.
So then we have, last but not least, we have, at least, before Breath of the Wild, last but not least, we have a 3DS game that came out, and it's called A Link Between Worlds. I have not played A Link Between Worlds yet, but I'm excited to. But it was rendered in 3D. It was a polygon game, but it was designed to directly reference A Link to the Past. So it's kind of like, even though A Link to the Past was sprites and graphics and 2D, A Link Between Worlds was 3D, but they were consciously trying to build the models to look kind of like they were in A Link to the Past.
Yeah, I can see that. I had a big fat question mark next to this one because
Sure.
I have not played this one.
So I haven't played it either, but it's my understanding that it's the beginnings of, there's technically Spirit Tracks, but that's basically the exact same art style as Phantom Hourglass. But in A Link Between Worlds, I understand that the game is kind of, from a mechanics point of view, it's the beginning of a non-linear gameplay that was expressed in Breath of the Wild. You don't have to do the dungeons in the same order. You don't have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can kind of do the dungeons out of order. And that's really all I really know about it.
I wonder why they went back to that style again, because why?
Maybe they were trying, maybe after Spirit Tracks was a fine game, but it was getting a little tired. And maybe Nintendo, maybe it was a different team, but they probably thought, we've been doing Wind Waker graphics for 4 or 5 games in a row now on handheld. Let's try to do something else. And maybe they were even experimenting. Oh, I have a deduction. I'm going to guess something.
Okay.
They knew Breath of the Wild was coming. They knew Breath of the Wild was going to have a very different mechanical system. How the game was played is going to be nonlinear and all that. Maybe they thought, let's try doing similar things on a handheld game. If it doesn't work, people won't care that much. But wait. So people feel more connected to it. Let's make it be the graphic style to one of the most loved games we've ever made in the Zelda series, A Link to the Past.
I think that's one thing that Legend of Zelda does that I think they learned with Breath of the Wild that they don't need to do anymore.
Is what?
Is go back to the same old thing over and over. And I think that's, part of me really likes that because it's familiar, it's nostalgic, I feel comfortable, but part of me is just like, you don't need to keep going back,
There's a lot of Breath of the Wild.
Things.
There's a lot of Breath of the Wild that references things that we are nostalgic for.
Yes.
But the system itself
does it in a different way.
Different.
Yeah.
Many say that Breath of the Wild is similar to the original The Legend of Zelda, because in the original The Legend of Zelda, you did not have to play the things in order. In fact, some would argue that the original Legend of Zelda is one of the first open world games to have existed, because the whole map is there and you just go where you need to go in the original one. So anyway, that does bring us to Breath of the Wild, and we've talked about Breath of the Wild a lot. This episode is going very long, so I think we should get going.
Yeah.
But do you have any final thoughts about Breath of the Wild?
Well, we kind of touched on it already, how the environment itself looks, I think, incredibly realistic. We've talked about before in other episodes. The water effects are amazing. I love the progression of time, how beautiful the sunrises and sunsets are. Any kind of beach location, I just gravitate toward in that game because they're gorgeous. And then the characters themselves are more cartoonish, more stylized. So I don't know if there's a ton more to go over because I think we've talked about it in other episodes too already, the art styles.
I would say that whether on purpose or not, Breath of the Wild at this point now is a culmination of a lot of the different art styles. And if Skyward Sword didn't do that correctly, Breath of the Wild does. If I'm repeating myself, but I think they found a good sweet spot here.
I'm okay with it getting a little scarier.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Well, maybe back toward Twilight Princess a little bit. I don't want a repeat Twilight Princess game, but I'm okay if things get a little creepier. And
I dove back into Twilight Princess, and those bloom effects are cranked to the max. There is goop and light, and that's funny because there's plenty of bloom in Breath of the Wild. They just kind of turn it to a realistic level. You know, when you look up at a tree and you see sunlight coming through it, it feels very realistic.
Yes.
Whereas Twilight Princess, sometimes it felt like you're in like a foggy dream.
Yeah, you're like underwater or something.
Almost.
It's a little bizarre.
Cool. Well, let's get out of here because we have another episode to record today, not to be too behind the curtain here.
Yeah.
But we're running a little bit behind schedule. And so, everyone, thank you for listening. This episode did run a little long. I know some of our listeners have told us that they like that, and that's super cool.
There was a lot of meat to this topic, though.
I guess so.
There's so many games to talk about.
Well, I guess whenever you run through most of the games, that does happen. It's true. People can find me on Twitter and Instagram by searching Raptor Paint. And Kate, if people want to find you, they can do that.
I'm just on Instagram. And my screen name is I Only Take Cat Pics.
Wonderful. Me. We love it when people find the show on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. By searching Another Zelda Podcast. You can tweet us, Another Zelda Pod. Or if you are listening to the show on iTunes, feel free to go find us over on YouTube, or vice versa. YouTube, if you want to listen to us in the car, find us on iTunes and Google Play and listen to the show there.
Leave us a comment on one of those methods. Let us know what your favorite aesthetic is, your favorite Zelda aesthetic.
I like that. Absolutely. All right, Kate, I'll see you in a minute, but I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay, bye.